Hello everyone, and welcome to Shooting the Gaps. My name is Se3ker, and this is part 2 of our look at Apologetics Press 6 Amazing Scientific Facts video. Last week we covered 3 facts: blood is the liquid of life, sanitation, and germ theory, because apparently it's utterly amazing that people would realize that if you bleed to death you die, that you might not want to camp on top of piles of poop, and that if you wait 3 days after touching a body, washing your hands really doesn't matter. As it is, today we've got 3 more facts to cover, and as you can see, I'm already hinting at one of them. I believe that's all I have as an intro, so I'll let you get on to the regularly scheduled video. And the next one. This one here, we get away from medical stuff. Yay! But we get into Noah's Ark and the flood. Boo! It feels like we always have to deal with this when dealing with creations. So if you've heard about the Wyoming and the Ark, you can probably tune this out. It's going to cover the ground again.
Done. Amazing scientific fact number 4. Ship engineering. While you don't go to the Bible for blueprints for a huge barge, you don't think, it just so happens that maybe that is where you go.
No. The Bible doesn't have any actual blueprints, and he's not going to point any out. I mean, I assume you know that already, but hyperbolic statements are annoying. Oh, and for once, we're going straight into the actual verses.
In Genesis chapter 6, verse 15, the Bible says that a man by the name of Noah builds an ark that's 300 cubits long by 50 cubits wide by 30 cubits high. And it just so happens this is a ratio of 30 to 5 to 3.
While Kyle's right, it is a ratio to 30 to 5 to 3. We'll also notice he didn't give exact dimensions. Perhaps it's because he knows just how ridiculous the size of the ark was. It was about 450 feet long, and, 75 wide and 45 high. While the full size of Noah's Ark is impressive, the length is the most important part. Why? Because as you are sailing the seas, when large waves hit a boat, it will go over the wave, and it's most likely to bend along its length before going down the other side. Thus, the longer it is, the more stress you get on that bending. A wooden boat of 450 feet long just is not going to survive major storms at sea. How do we know this? Let me show you. It's quite simple. We have the Schooner, Wyoming, and a very effective set of evidence for the maximum size of a wooden boat. So let's take a look. This is from the engine's ingenuity. It's the written version of an audio podcast put out by the University of Houston. It's information that is quite useful for these sorts of things. In the beginning of the 20th century, 9 wooden 6-masted ships were built. Wyoming was the largest, 450 feet long and capable of carrying 6,600 tons of coal. So not only was it the same length as Noah's Ark, but it was also a cargo ship like Noah's Ark. The Wyoming was a 6-masted sailboat, but it actually had a steam engine, but it wasn't used for driving the ship. Rather, it did all sorts of auxiliary things like hauling lines, reefing shields, sails, and most importantly, pumping out water. The Wyoming had a minimum crew of 11, but that was only because they had a steam engine to do a lot of the heavy lifting, which, of course, Noah's 8 people wouldn't have had. However, after 15 years of service, the Wyoming did sink. What brought the Wyoming down? A storm. A non-globe flooding storm. We should note one more tiny tidbit before we get to the cause of Wyoming's sinking. Thanks to the knowledge of ship of the lines from the 1800s, Wyoming's designers had stiffened her internal structure with steel bracings. Steel, which Noah wouldn't have had, in order to keep the ship from flexing too much. Well, she still flexed, which is why the steam-powered pumps in there to handle the leakage. Unfortunately, during the storm, it was too much. The flexing caused by the waves during the storm caused the Wyoming to leak so much that steam-powered water pumps couldn't keep her afloat. As I'm sure you've picked up, this storm could not possibly have been as bad as the global flood Noah's Ark was supposed to be handling. And the Wyoming, being the same size as Noah's Ark, still sank in it. The Wyoming, which had a steam-powered pump, sank because the wood flexed so much that its pump could not get the water out. So, do we believe that the prescribed size of the ark tells us anything useful? We already know wooden ships of that size, even with steel reinforcements, will sink under the force of a strong storm, not because they break apart, but because they leak too much. Yet he wants us to believe that this ark ratio is some form of divine knowledge, or couldn't have been arrived at in the past. So we're going to go back about a second and see what he has to say about Noah's Ark.
Of 30 to 5 to 3, length to breadth to height. Well, for thousands of years, the ark was the largest floating ship on record. In 1844, a man named Isambard K. Brunel built a huge ship called the Great Britain.
Wait just a second. This picture looks like it's not a wooden ship, so I wonder how accurate we are to the ark. Alright, here we have an article on the Great Britain. And we're going to scroll down here to where it talks about this ship in some decent detail. And we have two things to note. It's the largest passenger ship when she set out. So it was a passenger ship, not a cargo ship. And, here it was, an iron steamer. She had an iron hull. So here's the issue. If the Great Britain had an iron hull and was a passenger ship, then regardless of its size, it's not the same ship as Noah's Ark. It's not meant to carry massive amounts of super heavy cargo, just people. And it's got iron construction instead of wood. So the forces on the ship would be completely different. Or to be more precise, the way it reacts to the forces on the ship would be completely different. This makes the ship a bad comparison to the ark, and I have to wonder why he chose this ship as the comparator. As the one to compare it to? Something like that. Alright, so far we've covered 5 points that are poor, but we're about to go to the next point, which I think is mostly poor. It does have 1 or 2 possible good points. Shall we begin?
Fact number 5, quarantine. You see, in today's world of advanced medicine and understanding of germs, the idea of quarantining sick patients and separating them from those who are well, it's standard practice.
So, here's a good point. Quarantine has been hit or miss across the history of the world, as far as I can tell. Some places do it, some places don't, and sometimes it's done rather poorly. So, right, we're skipping to the actual verse he's going to talk about because, again, just because best practices were spotty in the past doesn't mean much of anything. The question is whether or not it's possible for the Bible to have known this from a non-supernatural source, and we're going to see what the Bible has to say.
From people who were not sick. The Bible, however, thousands of years before modern medical science understood the spread of germs, detailed measures to prevent their spread. In the book of Leviticus, we read that people with diseases such as leprosy were instructed to dwell alone, outside the camp.
All right, so let's consider this. Leviticus 13 is talking about a whole bunch of different symptoms that often have different pathways and developments. And if you had these sicknesses, you are unclean. And if these sicknesses progressed differently, sometimes you could become clean again, and sometimes you could not. It definitely sounds like more than one possible sickness. Alright, so not the most pleasant of topics, but something I feel like we need to deal with. First off, an issue of translation. Leprosy in the Bible and in Leviticus 13 is not about the modern disease. It's just not. So, the symptoms of the modern disease are discolored patches of skin, maybe flat and numb and look faded. growths on the skin, thick and stiff or dry skin, and can eventually result in numbness, and if nerve damage happens, and some weakness and enlarged. Anyways, the point is, if it's untreated, it's pretty bad. It can actually lead to some odd things, like the reabsorption of fingers and toes, which is just a weird thing to think about. But this is not what the Bible is talking about in Leviticus 13. So here we have Leviticus 13, and as we scroll down, we'll notice that there's some, if you get weird spots, let's look at them. So then we get to this section, and if we look through it carefully, we see that this is one of the semi-rare bacteria that grows in the hair and against the skin, or lice and the likes. And you can tell this because of what they do. It's an itch, and it's also noted to be a leprous disease. And it's clearly completely different. The others are like swollen pieces of skin and flaky, swollen skin and sores and other things like that. But this one is specifically something that gets in your hair and it needs to be shaved. So this section here shows very clearly that Leviticus 13 is several different diseases that have been dropped together in one section. It's also not the symptoms of modern day leprosy. What this means is that if this is given by an all-knowing God, then he's just thrown a whole bunch of diseases together in one thing just 'cause. Or it's a group of people who have a name for a section of diseases they don't really understand, but kind of sort of have a almost working way of dealing with. As you go through this, it becomes easier and easier, at least to me, to see this as multiple different diseases that have just been lumped together with barely any understanding of what they are. Now, there is one last thing I want to talk about here, and that's real leprosy. If the translation of the Bible was correct, and it was actual leprosy that they were dealing with, it should be noted that prolonged close contact with someone with untreated leprosy over many months is needed to catch the disease. This basically means these quarantine laws are needlessly strict if this was real leprosy, as we know it. That would make this a very bad law for an all-knowing God to have given out. Then again, we've already decided it wasn't actual leprosy, but I just felt like this had to be said due to common misconceptions about the disease caused by the Old Testament. And one last piece. Do we honestly believe that our ancestors weren't intelligent enough to notice when one could quarantine to prevent disease spread? Do we think that they couldn't go, well, I'd rather not be around somebody with a nasty, visible disease? Like, oh, look at that. That guy looks nasty. I'm going to go stand next to him and let him breathe on my face because, I don't know what a germ is. Yeah, no, our ancestors just weren't that stupid. So, as I noted at the beginning, point number 5 isn't a bad point altogether. However, it's also just poorly executed and not enough for me to think, oh, God is the only source of this. Point 6 is similar in that where we can argue it's almost good, but there's still major issues with it. This is going to be the final amazing so-called scientific fact, and we're going to have to look at this one very much in the same light as all the others. Could this have only come from God? And if it did come from God, could it have been given better?
Amazing scientific fact number 6, food regulations. In the United States, we have the Food and Drug Administration. It's the FDA. And it's designed to make regulations that keep people from getting sick from foodborne diseases mostly.
So, first off, he's comparing the food regulations in the Old Testament to the FDA. The problem being, the FDA spends a lot of time updating and changing their regulations as knowledge of better methods and other things come up. However, the Old Testament does not. While he believes this came from God, so we can assume that the regulations are the best possible with the ancient Jews' technology level. Alright, so he's looking at foodborne diseases for things that are regulated in the Old Testament. He's about to give an example about pork, and we are going to start comparing what the Bible says to what we actually know from there.
But the Bible, especially the Old Testament, written some 3,000 years before modern times, exhibits a knowledge of food-borne diseases that surpasses anything that was around during the time of the writers. For instance, when you look in Leviticus chapter 11, it mentions that pork was not to be eaten. That's a wise regulation, as we have seen. Even the modern FDA puts regulations in along those lines.
So, we're going to start with pork, because it's kind of a cliche and classic one. Yes, pigs aren't the most safe things to eat, but that doesn't mean God had to forbid them. After all, as God, he would have known ways of cooking pork. We must assume that there's no way to safely cook pork using the technology, approximately Bronze Age, of the people at the time this was given out. Problem is, there is. How to cook a pig in a pit. Literally, pig in a pit. This is a methodology that is fairly common for cooking a whole hog safely. This nice little diagram shows us a simple method of doing so. You dig a hole lined with stone or bricks, fill it up with coal, wrap up and flavor your meat, dump it in there, and cover it with dirt. The easiest thing in the world. Most notably, you're lining with stone or bricks. It's easy enough to bake bricks even in their times, so it's hardly an issue. And you can, in fact, fill the pit with logs and burn them down the coals. How do you know you safely cooked the whole thing? Well, it's fairly easy. Cooking time can be 12 hours on average, but you can go even longer if you're cooking a bigger meal. As you can imagine, if you're cooking for 12 hours, adding an extra hour on ain't gonna hurt anything. So it should be fairly simple for an all-knowing being like God to have given them proper instructions on cooking a pig that they could have done with the technology of the time. Now, you're asking, why am I holding this against God? It's quite simple. Having access to more food sources would have reduced the risk of starvation for the Jews. In other words, by banning pork when it was well within their ability to safely cook it, God has made it harder for them to get through times of famine. Next, we're going to look at Leviticus itself. So we're just going to pick out a few of the things here to see if they make sense as food sources for humans despite being banned by God. So the first one you'll notice is the neck camel, because it chews the cud but does not part the hoof, is unclean to you. So let's find out if camels are safe to eat. If we pop over here to the Journal of Ethnic Foods, we'll see that camel meat is nutritionally as good as any conventional meat source. In fact, has an edge over beef or lamb, camel meat is perfectly safe to eat. We're going to skip over the rock badger because it's like just a random mole thing in the ground, and so it's hard to get solid information on. But if we look at the hare, well, here's the thing. We have an article right here about the safety of eating an hare, and as we see down here, they're safe to eat as long as you cook them well. And as we saw with the pig, it's thoroughly possible to cook something well with little more than stone and brick and coal, which is, again, easy enough to do with the technology of the time. Given the differences in size, I'm going to say that a rabbit is safe to eat. No matter how we take this chapter, we'll see that it's not perfectly done. And even if it was, it's not hard to imagine a group of people without God's help coming up with regulations like this. You can't eat a pig because they haven't figured out how to cook a pig safely. But you can't eat a hare because, well, you can't eat a hare. It fits into a broad category. You can't eat a camel, even though it's perfectly safe to eat. It looks exactly how you would expect a hit or miss kind of learning as we go what is safe to eat and what is not safe. This does not look like a god. This looks like a group of people working it out as they go, which is how you would find out if something is safe to eat. If people get sick after eating pork several times in a row, you're like, maybe it's not safe. If people get sick after eating lizards, which Kyle mentions might have salmonella poisoning in them, well, maybe you shouldn't eat anything that's somewhat lizard-like. They don't realize you can cook them or grow them safely, so they're like, yeah, nope, you can't eat these things. Thus, we have these food regulations. So, we've come to the end of the video. I will let Kyle have his last word, then I'll give my final thoughts.
That scientific accuracy proves the Bible's divine origin.
There we go. I think I have shown where it's nowhere near as accurate as it sounds. I could have gone into more detail with everything, but feel there is no reason to do so. The Bible clearly doesn't get it nearly as right as an all-knowing and all-powerful God should. None of these facts show supernatural levels of knowledge, and that means that none of these facts are, in my opinion, good proof of God. I am Se3ker. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up, make a comment, or possibly even subscribe. See you later.